Israel has yet again rebuffed international calls to end the offensive in Gaza. This multiplies global concerns over whether the United States should condition, if not halt, its military support for Israel. This comes as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu welcomed Washington's veto on a United Nations resolution urging a ceasefire in Gaza. Netanyahu hailed the Biden administration's move in the Security Council. He also thanked U.S. President Joe Biden for yet another shipment of ammunition for the use of the Israeli army.
היום יגיע משלוח נוסף, בעצם הוא כבר נמצא פה, של תחמושת חשובה להמשך המלחמה. אני מודה לנשיא ביידן, איתו שוחחתי שלשום, גם על כך שארצות הברית התייצבה בצורה הנכונה והצודקת במועצת הביטחון, וגם כמובן על הסיוע החומרי שארצות הברית נותנת לצבא ההגנה לישראל.
With its veto, Washington dashed a growing call for a halt to Israel's operation, but also found itself on the receiving end of global condemnation. The Turkish president said a just world is not possible with the United States in it. He also denounced the United Nations Security Council, describing the international body as the Israel Protection Council.
Sadece Amerika'nın red oyuyla maalesef malum ateşkes reddedildi. Tek başına. Böyle adalet olur mu? Böyle adil bir dünya olur mu? Ama biz ne diyoruz? Aslında adil bir dünya mümkün. Ama Amerika ile değil.
People across the globe also took to the streets marching against the U.S. veto within the United States. 200s rallied demanding that the Biden administration stops its financial aid to Israel immediately.
We are asking for a complete end of the Israeli aggression on Palestinian people and an end to all the U.S. complicity, whether it's financial, political, or military backing of the Israeli genocidal project.
And it makes me very ashamed that my government is doing this in my name. I would like to see no more funding, no more weapons to Israel. That would stop the situation really fast. But until then, unfortunately, the people in Gaza will suffer.
But amid the global outrage, the U.S. government used an emergency authority to allow the sale of about 14,000 tank shells to Israel without a congressional review. An Arms Export Control Act emergency declaration was used for the immediate delivery of the tank rounds worth over $106 million. Remember, the shells are part of a bigger sale that the Biden administration is asking the Congress to approve. The larger package is worth more than $500 million and includes 45,000 shells for Israel's Merkava tanks. These tanks are regularly deployed in the onslaught in Gaza, which has killed thousands of civilians. In fact, a recent study published by an Israeli newspaper has found that Israel's aerial bombing offensive in Gaza is the most indiscriminate in terms of civilian casualties in recent years. The analysis found that in 3 earlier operations in Gaza from 2012 to 2022, civilian deaths made up about 40% of the total deaths through airstrikes. But in the first 3 weeks of the current operation, the proportion of civilians killed rose to 61%. This ratio is significantly higher than the average civilian toll in all the conflicts around the world during the 20th century. The U.S. faces mounting international pressure in light of the massive number of civilian casualties only increasing manifold as the war rages on. Halt Barel is the former director at Israel's National Security Council. She is now joining us live from Tel Aviv. Ms. Barel, welcome to WION World is One. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Do you also think the U.S. landed itself in trouble when it vetoed the United Nations Security Resolution on Gaza? And What do you think about the international outcry over the move by US? Some even saying the country risks complicity in war crimes.
Well, I obviously disagree with that completely and reject that. I think the United States is doing the absolute correct thing by denying Hamas the ability to achieve a ceasefire and get away with what it's done before Israel can achieve its very specific goals, regain its security in its southern border, and get back the hostages. There's a very simple solution to this that doesn't involve the UN, which is Hamas releases the hostages and lays down its weapons, and then ceasefire can be achieved. Other than that, I feel all of this discussion is somewhat theoretical.
Halt, don't you think that is double speak and double standards from the United States? Because on one end, they're saying that they will fight with Israel to defend the nation and to eliminate Hamas. And on the other, they're saying that civilians should be protected. But Israel seems not to be listening.
No, I don't think there's either of those are correct. I don't think there's double speak, because I think it is very important to minimize, whenever possible, damage to civilians and uninvolved humans. There's absolutely something that needs to be kept in mind. You're saying Israel isn't listening. I think anybody who knows anything about military force and military capacity knows that if Israel didn't try very hard to avoid civilian casualties and civilian harm, this would have been over by now. This is not the case because of the amount of care that's being taken to try and minimize that harm. So I don't see a conflict between the United States saying Israel has a right and, in fact, an obligation to defend itself and to go after Hamas in the way that it does, but at the same time, try to protect civilians as much as possible within that endeavor.
Halt, do you think the U.S. is funding the war when President Biden is seen as pushing the Congress to validate tank shells for Israel's war in Gaza? And before you answer that, it's important to mention that the Biden administration has used an emergency authority to allow the sale of about 14,000 tank shells to Israel without congressional review. Your thoughts?
So the issue with Congress, I think, is well known, is that the United States Congress right now has its own issues that have to do with issues not related to the military fund itself. In other words, there's no problem of support for Israel in the Congress in passing this package in those terms. Where things are getting mangled with the larger package that has been requested is within the U.S. political system, with issues like immigration that are being tacked on, and so on and so forth. So I don't think it's really saying President Biden has to push Congress. I think Israel enjoys bilateral support in the U.S. Congress and has always. So that's how I see it. In terms of funding the war, there's no doubt that the U.S. support of Israel in munitions and in other forms of support and forces that are in the area, and missile defense systems that are that have been deployed and so on, is very, very important to Israel. But of course, Israel is conducting this war and fighting it with its people, with its munitions, and with its military capacity.
All right, I've been talking to the former director at Israel's National Security Council, Halt Barel. Halt, thank you very much for talking to us today.
Thank you.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.